Okay, good morning. Hemshech Ayin Beis, volume 3. We began the paragraph, page 1231. So, after distinguishing between Abba ve'ima, Gadlus Abba and Gadlus Ima, in simple English, the cognitive maturity of Chochma and the cognitive maturity of Bina, or in the reverse order, Bina and then Chochma, with the distinction being that in Bina, even though the Midas now have come to a point of very high level of maturity and development, where they're guided and even elevated to the level of Seichel, to the objective experience of the mind experiencing godliness, moving away from the subjectivity of natural emotions, while also obviously harnessing and directing those natural emotions as well toward a higher purpose. But we've moved even to what he called midas sichlim, that they've, especially primus hamoichin, which leads with the person being absorbed entirely by the divine, by Elokus, and the emotions going along with that automatically, but still those emotions have not changed in personality. Fundamentally, they've not been changed. They remain the same emotions. However, they've been expanded and matured to the highest possible level, as he made it clear. What Chochma, on the other hand, does, takes the person and takes the experience to a place that's higher than Hatfa altogether, meaning beyond the natural structures, to actually experience something that's beyond our own wiring. That's what he said. But we have to understand how that happens. So the paragraph that we began, Ayin, he said that first let's discuss the difference between midas and moichin. Midas is an extending oneself, in experiencing an emotion, an attraction or repulsion, or any particular emotion with something outside of yourself. So it's what he calls hamshacha v'yerida, lamata. Moichin is aliyah, and what he said later, aliyah and hafrasha, meaning he's that moichin is going. It's an aliyah going inward instead of going outward. Like we see, when a person is reflecting with their mind, they're not engaging with another. You're strategizing, you're thinking, you're contemplating. When a person is in a midas mode, they're engaging. He compared it to the difference between tainug and rotzen, where rotzen is drawn to something. It's an extension, it's being drawn to something, and tainug is the salmus ba'atzmei dafka. So tainug and rotzen are obviously not cognitive and not mind-based and intellectual-based, but in the spirit of the human being, they have a similarity that in moichin you also have, and moichin and midas have that similarity. In moichin itself, he said, you also have the difference between moichin de ima, moichin de ama, that also in intelligence itself, moichin de ima is loy b'bchinas aliyah v'havdala kol kach, even though compared to midas and emotions, it's still moichin, it's still intellect. So it is comprehending, but in comprehension itself, it's really a comprehension that is extending itself and developing an idea. And therefore, the effect it has on midas is not so much in elevating the midas to another plane, it's in expanding the midas, the emotions. Even the previous samoichin, where the midas become cognitive emotions, meaning that they're more than just subjective interest, they also are absorbed by a higher experience. The words he used. You can't call them mamish cognitive, meaning they're not completely on that mind level, the mind that is able to go outside of itself and experience something greater than itself, to go out of hatva, out of its so-called natural infrastructure. Chochma which we even see the way Chochma works. Chochma does not work by expansion. Chochma is the spark of an idea. It's actually receiving an idea from a higher place and sensing that there's something greater, not so much that I understand and I comprehend. So that, because it's Aliyah Avdallah, Kodesh, so it also impacts emotions, that the emotions, which are also affected by Chochma. There is an emotional reaction when a person conceives of an idea. But they're Sichli Mamish, and they're Bechinas Aliyah v'Yitziyah me'inyan ha'atval legamri. It literally, so-called, another word transforms. It like catapults them into a place that's beyond natural infrastructure. It's basically a very high level of bittul. So the emotions are now basically, to put it in different words, Chochma is able to take emotions, subjective emotions, and allow them to experience something that's beyond any subjective interest that emotions are naturally inclined to. Bina can guide and harness the emotions and can refine them, as we said, direct them toward greater goals, because Bina is still part of the human being understanding something. And Chochma is a taste of the infinite, of the divine that's beyond understanding. So it's still Chochma. It is, as we learned, some form of intelligence, but it's really intelligence that's more about resonance and about truth and about elokus than it is about understanding something as an idea. As we discussed, that moichin helps us experience something that's beyond ourselves. But there's levels. You could have moichin and still experience it and still be part of the experience in a subjective way. That's why people can be very smart and arrogant too. Chochma, however, is fundamentally bittul. Someone that has Chochma always knows and senses a reality that is greater than themselves. So it's essentially a state of humility. Though he doesn't say this right literally here, but at the end of volume 2, we learned about it. And earlier in Ayin Beis was discussed this at length, how Chochma and Bina, the difference between the two. We're going to learn more about it in the next pages, how Chochma is Ayin and Bina is Yesh. But for now, he's just summing up. So basically, their effect on the subjective emotions, we're talking even emotions that are divinely directed, where you're appreciating God, whether it's the God that is giving you life and sustenance, or God as your father, or even God as the greatness of godliness within existence, or even the greatness of godliness beyond existence. And still, Bina doesn't have the power to take the emotions to a place that's outside of their own character. It would be like the difference between two types of leaders. A leader that's very inspiring and is able to get people and push them to their limits, to do things to the fullest possibility potential, and a leader that's able to get people to go on Mesiras Nefesh, to go outside of their very natural character. So you can understand there's very different types of leaders. So Bina is more of the former, and Chochma is the latter. Okay. So regarding the parentheses, I did look up. So I'm up to the parentheses, the second parentheses, but I first want to just comment on the first parentheses where it says, "Va'ayim hashakasa b'biyuri azer." The Maimer Azer Apostle Mereish Tzurim. So yes, indeed, there's a biyuri azer from the Mittler Rebbe, where he gathered all the explanations of the Alter Rebbe for a number of years, Friday night. Every Friday night explained the Zohar of that week's Parsha. And the Alter Mittler Rebbe gathered it together in a sefer. It's called Piyuri Hazer. The Tzemach Tzedek has notes and comments and elaborates on these ideas in his Biyuri. So we have a Biyuri Hazer of the Mittler Rebbe, a Biyuri Hazer of the Tzemach Tzedek, which actually consists of 2 volumes. So Biyuri Hazer that he's saying here is usually the Mittler Rebbe, and there's a whole mimer that talks exactly about this subject. Chochma and Bina, the midas within Chochma, the midas within Bina. Learning that can help understand this, but there's nothing there that I'm going to quote now particularly. he generally talks about these two levels. How in Chochma that's much more, the midas are completely on a Chochma level, like the Tipus Moyach Ha'av, Chochma's Abba. So he calls it, that's what he calls Meresh Surim. Surim are like mountains. And that from the heads, the top of the mountains, that's Chochma, Resh. That's where the midas are completely on a level of Chochma. And in Bina, the midas are beginning to take form and shape, like it is in pregnancy, like in the mother. That's where the fetus begins to develop. So the midas begin to develop there. That's part of what he discusses over there. I know we're learning that we're already on a level that's beyond Ibur. We're already in the level of Moichin. But Mamata Lamaila, when you go from the bottom up, you begin with emotions that are just behavioral and concealed until you get to more emotions, until you get to intellect. But when you think of it from a Maila Lamata, how it's all formed, how God creates intellect and emotions. So intellect, as I explained, is God simply using a vehicle that he would implant inside the human being, a mind, to be able to perceive things that are beyond our subjective interests. And Midas is actually experiencing it emotionally. So that process begins in Chachma, but there the Midas are very, very lofty and sublime, almost invisible, if not completely invisible. And in Bina, they begin to start having some shape and form. So in the context of our discussion here, Bina, obviously, since it's more connected to the Midas at the end of the day, it doesn't transform them. It doesn't elevate them to something beyond their natural scheme. Okay. So now we're up to the parentheses, v'yesh leimer. It's going to give a yesh leimer to explain this level of what Chochma does to Midas, that it causes them to go out of their natural infrastructure. Inyan ha'atva. Remember, mutva, murgish, muskel. So there's a muscle that still relates to mutva, that's bina, and there's a muscle that takes it outside of the world of mutva altogether, the natural structure. So he's going to say, v'yesh leimer. I just want to, just give me a second. I want to bring the Tanya that he's going to quote. I want to see it inside. 1 second. Okay, so the Rebbe Rashab is now citing a Tanya, chapter 23. It's a famous Tanya, and he's using it to help explain what we just learned about Chochma. Just want to see it inside because there's a language there. I want to see if it has certain terms that he's going to use here. So he says, v'yesh leimer, well, we can say, shezehu that this, and most obviously he means by this, he means that which we just said, that Chochma, which is in itself a Moichin da Abba, which is be'etzem aliyah v'havdalah, causes that the Midas too should be sichlim mamish, literally cognitive, meaning the cognitive, absorbed in the cognitive experience, and a state of aliyah v'yitzir from their natural structure. So he says that this is what it says in Tanya chapter 23. Sha'ovis hein hamarkova. So the Medrash says the ovis hein they were indeed the markova. What's a markova? Is a chariot. And what the Tanya is coming to explain, that their entire personality was not about themselves. They were a chariot to the rider. So what's a chariot? A chariot is a vehicle that carries the one who's riding in it to wherever they have to go. The chariot doesn't have a will and a desire and an agenda of its own. There's no subjective interests. It's a complete merkava to the one riding in it. That's why we talk in the Yecheskel, in the book of Yecheskel, you talk about the Navi, when he prophesizes and visualizes what's called the merkava. So there's different merkava. There's the merkava that Yeshaya, the prophet, visualized. Yirmiyahu, Yecheskel is the famous one, the merkava. Why is it called merkava? Because what they were visualizing were the supernal, the cosmic angels and structures above that serve as vehicles to carry the divine. Like when we say God sits on a throne. Hashemayim kisi va'aretz hadem ragli. Shemayim, heaven is my throne, my kisei, and the earth is my footstool. So obviously it's an analogy, it's a metaphor, but these are entities that help us understand in an example form what it means that something is completely dedicated to the one that it's serving. It doesn't have a separate agenda. So Merkava is another word used to explain how these higher supernal states, whether it's like we heard about the Merkava of Yecheskel, had 4 sides. Pnei Adam, Pnei Nesher, Pnei Aryeh, Pnei Shiur. Different faces. These are all spiritual states that serve as a vehicle for the divine. So really, we're using a muscle when we say Merkava, but it helps us understand that something is completely dedicated to something greater than it. So the Alter Rebbe, using this medrash, says these words, Shekol Evrehem Kulam, that the Avos, all their organs and all their limbs, Evarim, Hayukadeshim Umuvdalim Minyane Elam Hazeh, were sanctified, but Kadeshim also here means as in separate from, like Muvdalim, from matters of this world. So although they lived in this world, but their entire being, meaning their very bodies, were completely removed from Yon Elam Hazeh. The loy nasa merkava rak l'rotzna the levade kol yemehem. And they had nothing else that they did but being a merkava, a chariot, only to the Ratzona Elyon, to the divine will alone, kol yemehem, all their days, their entire lives. This is literally a quote from Tanya, chapter 23. Now, obviously, this is extremely high level. This is the Avos are unique in this way. It's not something all of us can achieve. What's expected of us is to achieve it sometimes and in certain ways in our lives. But it definitely teaches us the standard of what it really means to complete Bittul. That's what the Merkava is. So what do you see from this? He uses the same word, Kadeshim Umuvdalim. Kadesh and Muvdal, what he said before by Chochma, that Chochma Mechin the Abba, which is a state of Kadesh, and he said Aliyah v'Havdalah, but it doesn't just Chochma is Aliyah v'Havdalah, it impacts the individual that the Midas also become elevated outside of their natural inclinations. And again, we're not talking about natural inclinations toward things that are forbidden or even neutral. Even if they're natural inclinations to Ava v'Yira, natural love and natural awe, this is what the state of Chochma achieves. So the Rebbe Rashab is giving an example by the Avos. They were basically affected by Moichin the Abba, which caused them to be able to have this Merkava. Moichin the Bina doesn't have that power. Ube'emes, this is the Rebbe Rashab now explaining, Ube'emes, and in truth, the Hakavona kan, the intention here, and I'm assuming here means the Tanya, but it's the Tanya through the eyes of this piece of Ayin Beis. So you could touch the Khan, you could say Khan goes on Tanya, or you could say Khan goes on the Maimer, that he's explaining the idea of Chochma over Bina. So he says, Loirak, that Kavana here is Loirak al Hadvav Gashmis, not just on physical, natural characteristics, Kim Gam Hadvav Ruchnis, but also spiritual characteristics. Now, he doesn't explain what he means by this. Most likely what he means is that we're talking here when you say Kol Evrehem, all their limbs and organs, obviously that means also physically. But the point is that it's not just a physical thing. It's not like just they use their arms and legs only to do godly acts. Like he says in Tanya, that their mouths were constantly speaking Torah. Their hands were constantly helping other people. That's one side of things. So instead of using their own bodies for their own needs and interests, which is their hatfa gashmis, They focused it also they focused it toward, not also, only to the divine. Hatvar Ruchnius most likely means that even their spiritual characteristics, like Avram was chesed. So we're going to learn soon that Avram was able to break his chesed. When he, for example, brought Yitzchak to the Akedah, when he bound him, that was not an act of open chesed. The natural inclination of a kind person, and especially a father, would be to protect his son. And yet, because God said so, he was ready to forgo and go against his very nature. So that's not just Hatvar Gashmi, it's also Hatvar Ruchnis. But probably Hatvar Ruchnis means in general also the spiritual makeup of who they were. That's what it looks like he's saying. Because the next piece is a little cryptic, and I'll try to explain it best of my ability. It's very dense. Now, the Rebbe Rashab is going with another Yeshlemer to explain this idea. But the concept is clear, that the Avos are example for the Moichin, the Abba, that actually elevates the Kadesh and moved from the natural state that they would have been on their own. The Yeshlemer, as a matter of fact, now that I think about it, if you remember the Rashi in Parsha Lech Lecha, when Hashem changes Avram's name from Avram to Avraham, so it says in Rashi, Lech mastignina shaloi, that till he was named Avraham, though he was definitely a godly person, and he committed his life to godliness and spreading godliness, but he was still under the control. His stagninus is like the stars and the mazolis, the signs that still define some of his destiny. When he became Avram, he was freed from all these natural predispositions that are defined by human characteristics and defined by the stars, so to speak, that define and help and part of the structure, the natural structure. In other words, he moved from the natural to the beyond natural, the supernatural. Okay. So here's what he says now, the rest of this parentheses. Before I go there, because it's a little dense, you need to introduce some ideas. Let me stop here for a second if anybody wants to clarify anything or ask anything. So here's what the Rebbe Rashab says now. V'yesh lemer, and we can say, in other words, to explain this, we can say, al pi ma shekosav b'mokam acher, according to what it explains elsewhere, the b'chinis yisoid hu rak tefach gavoya min ha'aretz u'mesham inyan ha'meifsim. So Yesod is one of the spheres. It usually refers to the hashpah, the transmission of a sphere. So Yesod in general is the transmission, but like when you say Yesod Abba, and we're talking about Abba here, Chochma, it's the part of Chochma that's transmitting. Not like Bina, and not like Midas at all. But still within Chochma itself, there's a thing called Yesod Abba. Even though he doesn't say Yesod Abba here, but he says that explains elsewhere that the level of Yesod is one step above Malchus, which is Aretz. Hurak tefach gavoy min ha'aretz. So a tefach is a measure, is a handbreadth. That's what a tefach is. It's the size of a hand. The tefach is a measurement in the Gemara. But here in Ruchnius, it means it's a step above the natural order. Aretz. Umishom hu inyan ha'meifsim. And that is the root of where miracles come from. So in other words, Malchus or Aretz is governed by the rules of nature. When you want to, what are the dynamics, so-called the spiritual dynamics, or the spiritual levels that need to be drawn from in order to create a meifus? So you need something that's a tefach higher than in Aretz. And that's Yesod. So that's the source of meifsim, which, as we learned before, is the miracles that are able to transform and suspend nature, that are not bound by the laws of nature. Even the miracles that are within nature, they are still miracles, but they're still controlled and within the parameters of nature. That's more like Bina. Chochma, however, has the ability to go beyond. That's when meifsim. So this is a level that is the level that's able to go beyond the natural, the meifsim. But we have to still understand what is this coming to explain and what is he saying exactly. So he continues. Omnom, in this same theme of tefach, so tefach is a sugi in Chassidus. It talks about what tefach means. So we find this word tefach used in different places. Another place it's used, he says, is when you're talking about the spine of the lulav. In the four meat species we take, we have a lulav, an esrig, hadassim, and aravis. Lulav is the palm frond. It's the tallest of the four species. The esrig is the citron, and that's bound by the hadassim, the myrtle, and the willows. So it says, al pi halacha, shidrei shalulav tzorich sheyetzi mahadas tefach. The spine of the lulav, it's called a spine, and that's why it's so important when a kosher lulav has to have a straight spine and not a broken one. It's like so-called the central rod within the lulav, that according to halacha, it has to be higher, at least a tefach from the hadassim. So if the lulav is the same size as the hadas, it doesn't protrude. It's puzzle. You can't use it as a dal minim because the lulav needs to be higher. And what's the measure? The minimum is a tefach. So what does Chassidus explain? What's the significance of this tefach? So this tefach we just said is yesod, which allows us to transcend the natural order. So he says, "Hu b'chinas." This shidrei shalulav, this spine of the palm frond of the lulav, which sheyetza, that protrudes from the myrtles by a tefach, that's called the darge, the level of das elyon. Hamachaber chochma bina. Das elyon that connects chochma and bina. Let me explain. One of the objectives of L'man yedu deresechem. Why do we sit in a sukkah? That we should know and remember what happened through the generations, what happened when the Jews left Egypt. Well, the idea, like we say, v'yadaita hayom, Yediyah is also part of the purpose of the four species. It's a way of reminding us, making us aware of the four different dimensions there are. There's different explanations for it, but bottom line, it's a form of Yediyah and Elikus. It's helping us to teach us something about godliness. So the role of the lulav and its higher state is because it's representing and reflects, the tefach reflects das elyon. We learned about das elyon. There's das tachten, which is the perspective as we see existence, we see godliness through the eyes of existence. And we learned that length in the end of volume 2. So das tachten, there's a yesh, and we come to discover that there's an ayin that creates the yesh. Das saying is the other way around, that God is the yesh amiti, the true existence, and the ayin is everything is nullified in his presence. So das elyon is a perspective from above. The lulav's height is meant to remind us of a higher way of looking at things, to put it in simple terms. And what is the role of das elyon? It connects chochma and bina. If you remember, when we learned earlier as well about das v'yadaita, he said das is his kashrus. Chochma is the spark of an idea. Bina is its elaboration. And das comes and can personalizes it and connects it and makes it intimate, part of who you are. So das elyon is mechaber chochma and bina. That is the level of the spine of the lulav that goes high. That's the tefach, higher. So what he said so far is that the concept of tefach is introducing something that's higher than the natural. It's the source of meifsim, and now he explained this das elyon that connects chochma and bina. As I said, this is very, very dense and very short. You have to know a lot of other maimorim to understand this. So I'm giving some explanation, but we still have to finish the point. What does he really want to bring across here? What's this adding exactly? I mean, it connects things, but what's really being understood? He says, Yesh leimer al pi ma shekosav. That means this is going to help us understand what we learned before. So let's finish reading the rest. He's going to bring now another thing about tefach. The pasuk in Tehillim says, "Hine tapchus nasata yomim," that your days are measured like handbreadths. The kapitel in Tehillim is talking about how how mortals are limited by the years and the days that God designates for them. She uses the word tafchus. Tafchus means plural of tefach. So just like handbreadth is measured and limited.
Tefachis. Hine tefachis nasata yomi.
Tefachis, okay. So nasata yom, in other words, so the days that we're given are measured like handbreadths. It's good to hear Rabbi Shlomo is here with us. That's nice. So the Zohar explains, what does this mean? Why are days compared to the word tefach, tefachis, which means handbreadths? So mavur, so it says, Be'inyan hine tefachis nasata mavur, and this is explained. This piece is taken from the Tzemach Tzedek, I believe, when he explains this pasuk in Tehillim. He says it's mavur de bezerach cheli gimel, dafresh amud gimel, in the third volume of Zohar, page 273, Isa, the tefach hu yud. Tefach represents a yud. A yud is a limited entity. It's like a dot, and therefore tefach is represented by yud. That's what the Zohar says. V'im kain, the foches. When you say plural, so it refers to two different levels of a yud. What is it? Hu yud the shem havaya. So shem havaya yud k vav k. The first letter is a yud, but there's another yud. The yud the shem adnai. When you look at shem adnai also has a yud. You say aleph daled nun yud. The yud at the end. So in Kabbalah, and Chassidus elaborates that the Yud of Havaya and the Yud of Adnai have a relationship with each other. It's like two ends of the spectrum. So what are these two levels? Chochmei la v'chochmei tata. I know this is very dense and brief, but I'll spell it out. So you may recall as well that Chochmei la, chochmei tata. Chochmei la, the supernal, the higher Chochmah, is the Chochmah of Atzilus, that precedes all the spheres. Chochmah Tata is the Chochmah of Malchus. That's the end of all the spheres. So when we say that God creates the world with Chochmah, so creation, it originates in Chochmah love. You may recall even that he said these two levels was the Ayin of the Yesh Hamiti and the Ayin of the Yesh Hanivra. So there's a Chochmah as it is, the Chochmah as it is God's Chochmah. So it's reflective of godliness. And then there's the Chochmah, God manifests and uses Chochmah, the Chochmah Yosad Oretz. He establishes earth. He builds the world with wisdom. So clearly, God's wisdom is more than just being able to be building a world. But the Chochmah law manifests in Chochmah Tata. And that is two yuds, because Chochmah is always a yud. Chochmah is always a spark. But there are two levels of yud, the yud of Havaya and the yud of Adnai. So what he's essentially saying, when it says tefaches, he's saying that Chochmei la, Chochmei tata are these two levels of tefach, which are the handbreadths which we compare the person's life to. That are their life, that the days of a person, I've given you days like driven by Chochmei la and Chochmei tata. That's what's explained in the Maimorim Chassidus on this topic. But what's the connection to us in our discussion? Ubederach klal, says the Rebbe Rashab, Inyan shalamayla muteva, hu shamidus hem gam kem b'bchinas das elyon. And in general, and that's the connection to our discussion here, is that when you talk about Chochma, moichin da Abba, remember, which now he used the word Yesod for this, which is the source of Moifsim, the Shidra, the spine of the Lulav, which is the level of Das Elyon, that connects Chochma and Bina. And now, from the Zohar, that it refers to Chochma again. Chochmei la and Chochma tata. So bottom line is that Chochma is connected to a level that's higher than nature. So therefore, when Chochma is affecting and impacting, and what is it doing? It's taking the midas that the midas are elevated also to the level of Das Elyon, which is a very big chiddush. Why? Because midas, as I explained, are subjective. Midas is all about you, what you feel. So it's basically das tachten. You feel things from your perspective. For your emotions to be lifted to a place to see and feel things from God's perspective, Chochmah is not such a kamashma, it's not such a chiddush, because the mind naturally even is able to go places that beyond itself. But here the chiddush is, what he's saying here is that the Chochmah lifts the midas to a level of das alyan. And that's the inyan shalamayla mahateva, higher than the natural infrastructure and the wiring of these subjective emotions. So basically what he said in this parentheses, there's a lot to unpack here. First he said the Yesh Lema, this is the Avos, who are on this level. They're Kadeshim Umuvdalim, and their entire beings is transcending Hadvar Gashmis and Hadvar Ruchnius. And the next Yesh Lema comes to explain that in the spheres, that's referring to the level of Yud, the Chochmah, that elevates the Midas to that state. So what he's adding with this, on a very basic level, he's adding the levels, telling us where exactly geographically in the spheres, how this works. But I definitely feel that there's also a Havanadik explanation here. He's adding explanation to it. That may need more thought and more discussion, because it also comes after the words, so I'm thinking that that in order to explain what that means, that you're really going out of the parameters, Chochmah as being the level that goes beyond the structure, the Yud, the Tefach, that's higher, is that level. But it doesn't really give a lot of Havana explanation here. He really just, as I said, connects it and gives us the location. So I have to think more of this, something that we can really say this explains. But the topic is not over. So this is not uncommon that the Rebbe Rashab will bring something like this in the parentheses. And then as we learn on, we start understanding what this means. Maybe we've seen this a number of times, that he begins by saying something briefly and then starts unpacking it and discussing it more at length. But he did bring all these levels. He brought the Biurei HaZayar, which, by the way, the Mereish Sudim also says is the Avos. So that maybe connects it also to the Tanya. And now this topic of the Tefach. Okay. Any questions? So let's continue after the parentheses now.
Can I ask a question about when it says that Yesod is Hurak Tavach Gvoa Mina Aretz and Misham Hu Inyan Hamosim, the reason why this Yesod, which is, I guess, I think you were saying connecting essentially Chachma and Bina, or in any way. I
didn't say that. No, that's Das Elyon connects Chachma and Bina.
Okay. Well, okay. The point being that the question is the reason why Yesod becomes the source of Mofsim is because it's above nature, meaning the wonders occur because they're dafka above nature. Is that the point he's trying to make there?
Aretz is Malchus, where the natural order is structured, and Yesod is a step above that, Tefach above that, which is the level that is beyond natural order.
Got it.
Okay. So we've established that Chochma is Aliyah v'Yitzim in Hatva, and it lifts the Midas to that level. The Gam, he says now, after the parentheses, last two lines of the page. The Gam alidei Gadlus Abba, in addition to elevating the Midas outside of natural order, their natural structure, Mishtanim Hamidis, Mahadva Shalahem. Remember, there were two things he spoke about before. One is it's bound to the natural order, and the other is that it doesn't change. Chesed doesn't change to Gvura. Those were the 2 points he made. B'meichen the Ima, the Gadlus Ima Bina expands and refines the emotions, but it can't change them, and it also does not stop them from being natural. They're still bound to their natural structure. Like he said, lo yizbatlu from that. Chochma, we just said, takes the emotions outside of their natural structure, but furthermore, or gam, mishtanim amidas ma'adva shalahem. The emotions actually change from their natural characteristic. Ukamoi, ba'avram avinu olav hashalom. We see by Avram Avinu, shekovesh rachmov ma'al b'noi yechidei, where he restrained and he controlled his compassion and his love for his only son, Yitzchak. So when the Eibishter told Avram to bring Yitzchak on the Akedah, besides the fact that every father has a natural love, and he says, Bincha, Yechidcha Sherahavta, you love him. And especially Avram, who's a Isha Chesed, and yet, Kovash Rachmov, he was able to subdue, control that love. Ma'al b'nei yechidei, shu hepach teva hamidus legamri. Not only is it the hepach of chesed, it's the hepach of midas altogether. The emotions one has, the love to a child, and here Avram was able to achieve that level. And maybe this is why he said in the parentheses, he brought the Tanya, because Avram was a Merkava. And Merkava doesn't have its own personality. Even though Avram is Taka Chesed, and the Merkava has, as I said, Pnei Adam, Pnei Nesher, Pnei Aryeh, Pnei Shiur. It has a structure, but its structure is only dedicated to the one who's riding it. So Avram was basically Batul Talakus. So though he had a personality, but his bittul was stronger than that and was able to override and thus change his very natural emotions. Teva hamidus legamri. The next page, 1232. This is not possible through the comprehension of Bina. Bina does not have the power to make such a change or transformation. Rak bittul de Chochma. This is only possible through that utter bittul and complete selflessness and suspension of self that comes through Chochma. So now he sees introducing the word bittul. He didn't say it before explicitly, but it was clear that it's that type of level of bittul. Now, of course, you can ask the question, how exactly do we apply this to ourselves? We'll talk about that. I don't want to go there right now until we finish the subject, at least till the end of this paragraph. So now he's going to bring, remember, we spoke about Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. What did we say in the previous page? That Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel weren't just their personalities were chesed and gvura. It impacted their very Torah. He said even their Gadlus Hasoge, they did not go out of their natural being. In other words, it wasn't just a personality thing. The way they understood Torah, their perspective on Torah was chesed or gvuradik. Beis Shammai Eisrim, Beis Hillel Matirim. And also their derech ha'aveda, the way they served. We said, Ketzem meragdim lifnei akala. But now he's going to show that even Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel, you also have a sense of changing. And that's where you find the exceptions. That there are exceptions, 3 exceptions, or whatever the number is, where Beis Shammai is more lenient and Beis Hillel is more stringent, more strict. If they were unable to get out of their natural structure, that would never happen. So he says, Shezeu shini b'hamidus. This is a change in their midas. Shezeu mebchinas meichin da Abba. So because Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel were, besides being brilliant scholars, and besides having a strong emotional inclination, chesed and gvura, that's where their neshamas were rooted. But they also had bittul, the meichin of Abba. And that's why there are instances where Beis Shammai behaves in a form of chesed, lenient, and Beis Hillel in the form of gvura. It's still obviously all al pi Torah. But you see, earlier in Ayin Beis, in volume 1 in the beginning, he spoke about achlifu dichtayu, that because the bittul of the eris and the kelim, that sometimes you could have the er hagvura in klei chesed, and the er chesed in klei hagvura, you could have a change, like a cross wiring, but it's always due to bittul. Because if there's no bittul, you always will follow the kav that you were created in. Like when you talk about malachim, angels, they're incapable of changing their path. That's what it says in Chassidus. It says srafim emdim, and it's only a meshama that's mahalach. What's emdim? Emdim means it's always going in the same path. Mechol, malach mechol is always chesed. Malach gvuril is always gvura. Malach rafal is always teferes. So they have their kav. When the Rebbe's sicha on chess, when he explained the game of chess and the movements of all the players, of all the pieces, he explained that the three ministers, the rook, we call the bishop, and the knight, all can go very far. They can go across the whole board, but only in one path, either diagonally when it comes to the bishop or straight when it comes to the rook. The horse doesn't go across, but it's also always the same path. Two steps one way and one step. So bottom line is they can go far, but they never go out of their orbit, so to speak. And it's only a person that does Aveda that can go out of the orbit of Chesed or Gvura, like we're learning here. Avram, and now the second example here of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. And now let's just conclude the last few lines, and I'll stop to explain and hear what you, and if you have any questions. So now he's going back to the midas. Now that we've learned that there's this new level of bittul, where the midas are no longer even defined by their very natural state. Bina directs them, harnesses them, elevates them to the most refined levels, but does not change them and does not suspend them. Here, habilti murgish al midis, the kasher hameichin hein begadlus. Like we learned before about midas, that there's a point where you don't feel it. When you're so absorbed in the experience, you don't feel. When I say feel, there's no sensation that you can define. It doesn't mean there's no feeling. It means the feeling is completely absorbing you, so there's no subject and object. The kasher hameichin hein begadlus, when the meichin are in this state of maturity, oz midas einam murgoshim, the midas are not felt. Ubefrat b'bchinas primis hameichin. And this is specifically in Pnimis HaMeichin, as Commission is barely ill. In Chitzenis HaMeichin, you also have a level of that, where it's the mind is elevating the emotions, but there's still some emotional connection. Pnimis HaMeichin is higher than Midas. The Midas are elevated to this sensationalist state. So now, he's explaining what's the difference in Meichin D'Ima, Meichin D'Abba regarding this element of Midas not being felt. The intellect of Bina, the mother, Einam built in Mergoshim Legamri. You can't say that they're completely no sensation at all. Like you said before, you can't say they're Sichlim Mamish. They're going in that direction, but you can't say they're completely devoid of any sensation. Rak mebchinas meichin da'aba. It's only when you have meichin da'aba, that utter bittul. Hariheim mebchinas built in mergoshim. The midas are then a state of complete lack of identity of their own. She'ein b'chinas mitzias. This doesn't mean they've been destroyed. It means they're not a mitzias of their own. They're like that merkava. So the midas have now become chesed and gvura of godliness. Whatever God wants, that's what they become. So that's why chesed can change his personality and gvura can, because it's not about them. It's about the bittul to their source. And when you have the bittul, your identity and your personality does not become a factor. And only the bittul of the Abba has the power to take someone to that level. So in practical terms, I mean, you can find this, as I said before, two types of leaders. You can see someone inspired by the Rebbe, and they do everything that they're told to do. But when it comes to something that is really against their personality, they can't go there. They can't break themselves. They're not in that level yet. And then there's a level of commitment and Mesiras Nefesh, where it doesn't make a difference. Even if it's something completely against my nature, I do what I'm told. Total soldier. Now, this is not about being critical of a person's level. It's just two different levels. And it is two different levels of bittul and two different levels of Mesiras Nefesh even. With the second one, actually a person, their midas do not become a factor. Now, that means that their midas will also go along. It's not they're doing it by grind. They're not doing it by biting their tongue or clenching their teeth. They're doing it b'simcha. But it's a level of bittul where it goes beyond. It's like the famous story with the Alter Rebbe when he told that Chassid, who was a tremendous Talmid Chacham, to become a Balagola, which is completely not his nature. Not only not his nature, he was a person who could have sat in Beis Medrash and learn and teach for 20 years. He drove a cab, basically. He drove a wagon. Talk about a merkava. But that's what Alter Rebbe told him, and he did it. It's not doing it one day or 1 week, 20 years. And that's an example of something going beyond the natural that he's describing here. Now, what still needs to be explained is exactly how does this work? How do you reach such a level? What is taka the difference between Chochma and Bina? They're both divine attributes. They're both divine mind aligned with what God wants us to do. So he's going to explain, going further, what the exact difference between the two are. Basically, Chochma being Ayin and Bina being Yesh. And there's no question that the Alter Rebbe Rashab here is laying out the operational elements of implementing the central themes of Ayin Beis, of creating an interface between us and godliness. This is very clearly going in that direction. We see it. I mean, you can see just from the way he's speaking about it, starting from our emotional subjectivity, moving to the divine, first on a subjective level, to all the way to divine objectivity, if you wish, that he's talking about here, these highest levels of bittul. Okay, so we're going to stop here regardless, but anybody wants to weigh in, questions, comments? Okay. Pretty powerful, huh? Yeah. So then with the examples I gave, when a person's reading a book or listening to music or sees a wonder, you could experience it and deeply experience it, but there's still some element of you that you sense, or you could be completely absorbed and there's no sense of anything. You're just lifted to another place, transported to another place with no sensation at all. And both of them have emotions at work. But one of them you're sensing yourself and the other one you're not sensing. Like, for example, does a fish sense that it's in water or it's just its natural state of being? When you put your hand in water, you sure feel wet. There's a sensation. But imagine you become wetness. You become it. Not just you're swimming in the waters of Deis Hashem, it's completely submerging you. You're like in a mikveh where it's completely, all it is Deis Hashem, and you're just part of it, like a fish in water. And that's why Rav Shimon ben Gamliel, there's a day opinion, not the halacha, that a fish is not a chatzitza. If you go into a mikveh where there's a fish, the fish is considered like water itself. It's not considered like an entity that is blocking. Anything else would be. So a fish is because it's like one with the experience, totally in the zone. Yeah, that's the highest level here.
So
The key thing. One second. So the key thing is that this is an elikus. You can definitely find examples of it in the secular world, just to make it easier to understand. When you're so let's say, immersed in a project, and it's overnight, and the hours roll on, you don't even realize you're hungry. You don't even realize what time it is. You suddenly realize it's 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock in the morning, and you haven't eaten or drink. These are experiences where we become so absorbed that your whole being. It's just an example. I'm not going to say it's exactly this level, because we're talking here the Avos, Merkava, and so on. But nevertheless, it's a somewhat of a taste of it. Okay, go ahead. 2 people want to speak. Whoever wants to go.
My question is, and we're not there yet, but we're clearly seeing here, can the midos can you change your emotional composition? Can you change your nature, at least your emotional nature? And here he's saying you can, and here's how. Here's what's happening in the ethereal realms that enables this to happen. And you explained it very well. The question is, and I know you may not be able to answer, you may be able to answer, but not from what we've read so far, is whether that can become a permanent change, or whether it's just somehow temporary when you're caught up in that moment of bittul. So, for example, Beis, Beis Shammai, they had these instances where they switched their midos, so to speak. But
so you're asking me if it's temporary or permanent?
Well, yeah, I guess.
We'll see. I don't know. He hasn't spoken about it yet. We'll see. The bottom line is, even temporary indicates that they were able to get beyond their nature. Some people can ever do that. Some people that never change their natural inclinations. So we'll see how, the Avos was the whole time they were Merkava. But Avram wasn't asked to always do this. It doesn't mean a person has to always change. It means they're capable of changing, and at times they will. The point here is that we're not bound by these laws of nature. To what extent? I mean, everybody's going to have to figure out on their own. You're talking on these levels, it's not expected. Shammai and Hillel was not expected that they should constantly cross. Even if they did it once, it shows you they're not bound by their natural inclination. That's enough. Same thing with Avram. But we'll talk about it. We'll see how he goes. Each person, the first step I would begin is, are you capable of it? And it's going to require a Bittul of Chochma to make you capable. Then the question is, when does it have to be implemented and when not? It all depends on what's expected by Torah. The Torah doesn't always demand that a person has to constantly be completely beyond his nature. Sometimes you need to be in your nature. Sometimes you need to go beyond it. Sometimes you need to elevate your nature to beyond nature. Anyway, this is not yet a final picture anyway, but regardless, he's developing this idea, and not sure how far he's going to go with how it's implemented in our lives, but we'll cover it as much as we can.
Thank you.
Svi, you wanted to say something?
I know. I just wanted to say that the fish, according to what you were saying, because the fish itself becomes part of the Arbim Sar, right? The 40, it actually becomes part of the 40. I think I'm asking you.
The fish becomes part of the water, is what I said. What do you ask?
No, you actually said it doesn't obstruct. I just wanted to emphasize that I thought it means it becomes actually part of the 40.
That's why it's not an obstruction, because it's considered to be like water. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so we'll stop here, the top paragraph on page 12.